All right. This presentation, Civil War, it's our third presentation looking at the Civil War. We looked at some battles and campaigns early in our presentation last week. Today, this will go over the reading that we've been working on right now. We're going to look at some economic stress caused by the war in the North and South, women in the war. We're going to look at Civil War leadership and diplomacy. We're also going to look at the draft and just generally speaking, just briefly. Now, if you look at the slide above here and below, we have paper money. Now, paper money is kind of something we see all the time, but paper money at one point was a relatively rare issue. That money was generally in coin and it had its value in the metal that it was made out of. And paper, of course, isn't worth that much. But in the Civil War, both Union and Confederacy, because of a shortage of the metals and because of the need for money, began to print money, paper money. And in the North, they called them greenbacks, as you can see. It's green right there. The idea of printing money and circulating the economy allowed the Union and Confederacy to purchase the materials that we need for the war effort. It's kind of interesting if you take a look in the Confederate States of America. Confederate money, of course, right here in the middle is the central institution of slavery. Idealized pieces of art representing government and history. In this case, you can see that this money represents a little bit of some of the classical art that we see in Union money also, but also the inclusion of slavery. By the way, at the end of the war, this money wasn't worth the paper it's printed on because money is today, paper money is backed up by the power and the stability of the government that issues it. So what happens is when a government that supports the value of currency goes under, the money isn't worth the paper it's printed on. So essentially, the money you have in your pocket right now is only as valuable as the government, American government, that has printed it, that guarantees it. And money, of course, is value will change over time. We'll see that in our presentation. You can get this to go ahead. Here are our key questions. We'll look at inflation. We talked about that briefly earlier. What is inflation and what's its value? We're going to look at why would inflation be an issue in the Union, but even worse in the Confederacy? How did war create new opportunities for women? And how did the Civil War challenge American diplomacy? And then finally, how did the Union and Confederacy deal with the shortage of military manpower? You can't field an army without soldiers. So we're going to look at all of those key questions. There'll be a quiz on this presentation following it, so please listen carefully. I hope you've pulled out the copy of notes as you've been instructed so you could have reviewed them and will follow along. So the first theme is economic stress caused by inflation. Generally speaking, inflation is something we have in any economy where there's currency, where there's money that represents goods. Inflation, generally speaking, is a decrease in the value of money. What is a dollar worth? Let's say, for example, in 2000, a basket of groceries or like any item is worth $100, and that 10 years later, those same groceries are now worth $120. So those same groceries, you're not getting any more value, but it's costing you 20% more. So we would say over that period of time, we have 20% inflation. So when like your grandparents tell you, oh, you have to pay a whole dollar for a candy bar, we got those for a nickel. What that tells you is the price. If you look at currency and look at a nickel is only worth 1/20th what it used to be because it takes you now 20 nickels to buy a candy bar. What causes inflation? Well, it could be caused by an increasing demand or a tightening supply of goods. So, meaning if a bunch of people all of a sudden want to buy something, like for example, think of toilet paper last spring, or if there was a constriction of supply, you're going to have inflation. So, for example, if there's a gasoline shortage caused by a greater demand or a restricted supply of gasoline, that price of gas will tend to go up, say from $2.50 to $3 a gallon. That would be 20% inflation, meaning that your dollar is worth 20% less at the gas station. If you take just generally an average of all the goods and services people buy, you could create a general inflation rate for any economy over a period of time. Like, say, for example, from 2019 to 2020, you take a basket of needed goods, you compare the price, and you can come up with an inflation rate. Generally speaking, right now, inflation has been, well, it's been kind of strange because of the pandemic. But for the last 10 or 15 years, inflation generally runs at maybe 2 or 3% a year. Inflation could also be caused by increases in the money supply. So if a government, say the United States government, decided we have all this debt, so let's just print bunches of money. If they did so and flooded the market with money, you're going to end up with inflation because there would be just as many goods, but with more money chasing them, the price of those goods would go up. Thus, the value of that money would go down. So the increased demand for goods needed to supply the army and for labor shortages because soldiers are off fighting or are being drafted into the army is going to cause inflation. The army is going to demand huge amounts of goods to fight the war, and the people that created them were often at war, so that the price of scarce labor and the price of scarce supplies created inflation. Add that to the fact that both the Union and the Confederacy printed money, as I showed you at the beginning, in order to purchase the goods they needed. In the North, they called them greenbacks. So by flooding more currency into the market would lead prices to go up. This was really bad in the North, but it was extremely critical and destructive in the South. Because the South's government that guaranteed the money was not really recognized, its value of its currency would go down increasingly as war prospects became bleaker. The South had to invent its own currency. Would it be trusted? Would it be accepted? If I give you a handful of currency, you only would want it knowing you could exchange it for something. And in the Confederacy, the economy, the value of their money, as you can see from this graph, would decrease. This graph on the right represents price increases if you would calculate them annually. So if we would go, for example, to January 1864, prices on an annual rate were going up about 614%, meaning that a dollar candy bar on that would be $6 by the end of the year. But by the time the war was near the end, Confederate money became about worthless. So it might take you, say, for example, $1 billion to buy a candy bar in the Confederacy. As the Confederates suffered because of the blockade, because of damage from fighting armies, its economy was crippled. So its currency became worthless. By 1864, we see that prices rising at 7 times a year, and the Confederate money would be inflated to the price of being worth less than the paper that was printed on. So indeed, it would be cheaper to burn your money than it would be to buy fuel to keep your house warm. Add this to the fact of wartime damage, the Southern economy was in shatters by 1865. So let's look at women in the war, and you have a picture right here on the right of Confederate nurses, and on the bottom, I believe that's a Union nurse, but I'm not quite certain. Labor shortages both in the North and South created new opportunities for women to work outside the home. More work in government, clerical positions, industry, and agriculture would be filled by women. And women were reluctantly allowed to engage into the carnage of indecent men whose body parts were blown apart. The blood and gore of the battlefield was a necessity for women to enter into the sanitation corps, into nursing. This was probably a great time and experience for women to show their skills as nurses and getting into the medical field. Clara Barton, who was the founder of the Red Cross after the Civil War, was one of these examples. Dorothea Dix is another woman whose experience made her a heroine as a nurse in the Civil War. But also, women famously served as spies during the Civil War, particularly in Washington, D.C. Generally speaking, men might let their guard down in the presence of charming women who were oftentimes underestimated for their intelligence and their cunning. And that's an interesting piece for research if we have some time to look at the women spies during the Civil War. Leadership in the war. The Civil War armies were led by generals who were either politically appointed or experienced military leaders. The political appointees were, generally speaking, some local official, a congressman or somewhere along the line, who could raise an army, and he was appointed a leader as a leader of a state militia. So some of these people had very little military experience and were simply just politically powerful. But other leaders like Lee and Grant were experienced military commanders who had graduated from the academies like West Point. Lee was in active service, and Grant had retired by the time when the war had come out and returned to service. These men, among others, had experience in the Mexican War, often fighting with each other. Grant had served under Lee in the war against the Mexicans in the Mexican War, but Lee didn't remember Grant when they met at Appomattox when Grant had said, I worked with you before, because these men, some of them were actually roommates at the academy. But when the Confederacy declared its independence, people like Robert E. Lee were forced to decide on what they would serve. Would they serve the state from which they were born, and that was the choice that Lee made, or would they save the nation and the Constitution which they were led to serve? Keeping in mind making the wrong decision made them commit treason. So indeed, when Lee refused a commission in the Union Army and served in the Confederate Army, he was committing an act of treason. So some people like Lee were not politically motivated in serving the war. It was more an idea of loyalty to state, but others were fire eaters and strongly supported slavery. Some would strongly oppose the draft. I mean, they would when there was time to draft slaves. And so the sub-Southern leaders who were fire eaters and really believed in the cause of slavery, what they were fighting for. When the war looked bleak and they were short on men, when there was the discussion whether slaves should be armed to fight, they said I'm not fighting for anything. That if I fight with a slave beside me, my cause is wrong, because their cause was so wrapped up in the defense of slavery. The officers on each side, as I mentioned, often knew each other, and we're going to do some research on some of these generals in the next couple of days so we could get a general idea of what these people were and what they did. Now, diplomacy, which is the art of conducting relationships between nations, was an important part of this war. Diplomacy is the idea of how to manage trade and alliances with other states. Like, for example, the United States has diplomatic relations with most countries around the world, with a few exceptions like North Korea or Iran. States traditionally need to be recognized. They have to recognize independence of states in order to engage it diplomatically. So, meaning that states have to recognize other states as their right to exist before they can really enter officially into the world of trade and diplomacy. Say, for example, I couldn't go to Ottawa in Canada and or to Mexico City, for example, and negotiate our class in a treaty with another country. Confederate officials quietly negotiated with Britain and France for aid and recognition of their independence. The Confederacy depended on the hope that Britain and France would say, yeah, you're independent. Here, let's make an alliance with you. Here's some, maybe a trade, perhaps. The Union would see that as an act of war, interfering in a rebellion, meaning that the South was a rebellious place, and if the countries of Europe helped it, it was aiding a rebellion within the United States. The Confederacy hoped that a big victory in the war against the Union would help France and Britain tilt toward the Confederacy and recognizing it. Maybe Britain and France would benefit if the country stayed permanently divided. While European factories desired Confederate cotton, though, the idea of slavery was very unpopular among the working people of Britain and France, and Britain had become actively abolitionist by the early 1800s. That was one big strike against the Confederacy's hope of being accepted as a state. Now, Lincoln knew this, and the Emancipation Proclamation, which made the war officially a war against slavery, would be a very powerful piece in that. No big Confederate victories were coming, and Britain and France would end the war not really recognizing the Confederacy's right to exist. Now, we know that there was a shortage of manpower in the Civil War, so they had to fill the ranks. How would they get soldiers to fill in the infantry, cavalry, and artillery units? After Bull Run, both the Confederacy and Union saw the need to build large and well-trained armies. The cause of the Confederacy to defend their homes against invaders from the north was probably more visceral, more felt than the cause of preserving the Union in the north, meaning that the Union's support for the war among the average person in the Union was not as strong as the Confederacy. But the Union had a preponderance of strength and numbers of people and how to supply them. But both sides were forced to begin conscription, the Confederacy in 1862 and the Union in 1863, which conscription is the forced military service set for a number of terms, for a number of years. It started off generally between 18 and 30, but as the war became more desperate, particularly for the Confederacy, they would expand the length of service and the age by which a person could serve. But large slave owners in the the South, were exempted from service, and rich men in the North could pay $300 to avoid service. But the threat of being drafted would help maybe drive some people to accept enlistment. You can see the poster right here. To avoid the draft, you can join the 7th Indiana Cavalry and receive a $100 bounty for all experienced recruits. The threat of draft did cause some people to join, but there were also large draft riots. The draft is something we'll see in Korea in the Vietnam War. Now, here is the key questions that I told you guys to look at. You want to take a look at those for a moment. We have a quiz coming up. Okay, thank you very